Plato is, I think, one of those philosophers who's, well, endlessly relevant, especially when we talk about democracy. In his work, The Republic, he, really doesn't hold back. Plato warns us about the dangers of unchecked democracy, what he calls mob rule. To him, it's this idea that when everyone has equal say, without any kind of accountability or expertise, things can spiral into chaos pretty quickly. Now, in Plato's view, democracy's flaws, at least as he saw them, were rooted in its tendency to prioritise popularity over sound judgment. And honestly, doesn't that sound, well, familiar today? Take populism, for example. We've seen how leaders with charisma, not necessarily competence, can rise to power by appealing to emotions rather than reason. Plato would probably see this as the perfect example of how democracy can sort of start to implode under its own weight. And then there's the role of misinformation. This is something Plato couldn't have imagined in his time, but his concerns about manipulation feel oddly modern, don't they? I mean, think about social media, platforms that spread half-truths, or outright lies at, lightning speed. It's kind of like giving a microphone to the loudest voices without really checking if what they're saying is, actually true. We've got algorithms that reward sensationalism, not wisdom. Exactly the kind of thing Plato would have feared in a democratic system. So, in Plato's world, a poorly managed democracy eventually gives way to something worse, like tyranny. A strong man steps in, promises to fix everything, and suddenly democracy's gone. And honestly, when we look at some of the trends in global politics, with the rise of authoritarianism in places where democracy seems strong, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? But of course, Plato didn't just stop at criticising democracy. He also had his own vision for what a government should look like. Philosopher kings, leaders ruled by reason rather than ambition. Now, I'm not saying that's something anyone would accept today, but, well, it's fascinating, isn't it? Still, Plato's critique gives us a lens to sort of think critically about how we use our democracies. Are we buying into populism? Are we allowing misinformation to shape, our choices? These are big questions. And they're not easy ones, but they're, I think, necessary ones. Now let's shift gears. While Plato was, pretty skeptical of democracy, Aristotle had a somewhat more practical take on it. He wasn't out here calling for philosopher kings or overthrowing systems. Instead, Aristotle believed in this idea of balance, what he called a mixed government. It's the idea of combining elements of democracy and oligarchy to create, well, stability. And here's the thing. Aristotle thought that the key to this balance was the middle class. He figured they were the glue that kept society together. Too much power concentrated in the hands of the wealthy? Not great. Too much popular rule from, the lower classes? Also risky. The middle class, according to Aristotle, is kind of this, sweet spot. They're not so rich that they dominate, but not so poor that they have nothing to lose. And he believed this middle ground led to civic virtue and, well, a more stable society. What's fascinating is how we can actually see Aristotle's ideas playing out in real-world examples today. Take Scandinavia. These countries are often praised for their social stability and effective governance, right? And you can see elements of Aristotle's vision there. They've managed to sort of blend democratic participation with systems that protect minority rights and ensure economic fairness. In other words, they've kind of struck that balance Aristotle was talking about. Of course, none of this is perfect. I mean, no system ever is, right? But Aristotle wasn't looking for utopia. He was a realist. He understood that good governance isn't about one single blueprint, but about adapting these principles to fit the needs of a society. Still, it's pretty remarkable how enduring his ideas feel, even centuries later. All right, so when we take a step back and compare what Plato and Aristotle had to say, you really see how their philosophies can sort of help frame the issues we're dealing with in modern democracy. Plato warns us about the dangers of unchecked populism and manipulation, while Aristotle reminds us of the importance of balance and the middle class. Both are, I think, incredibly relevant today. One of the biggest challenges we face is the erosion of public trust in democratic institutions. We've got people, losing faith in elections and political parties, even in the media. Aristotle might point to the lack of that middle-class stability. When economic inequality grows and people feel excluded, it's no wonder trust crumbles. Plato, he'd probably blame the way misinformation spreads and how, well, charisma can sometimes outweigh competence in leadership. And then there's the polarization, this us versus them mentality that's really like taking over public discourse. Aristotle believed in bridging divides, in finding that middle ground. But how do you even do that when it feels like society's split into silos, both online and offline? It's a tough one, right? This is where education comes in. Plato and Aristotle both emphasised the role of education in shaping informed, virtuous citizens. It's not just about facts and figures. It's about critical thinking and, honestly, understanding the responsibilities that come with living in a democracy. And there are some really innovative civic education programs out there today that are trying to do just that. Things like teaching young people how to identify misinformation or how to engage in constructive dialogue, even when they don't agree. It's kind of inspiring, actually. So maybe the lesson here is that democracy isn't this finished product. It's messy, it's flawed, but it's also something we can work on, refine and adapt. Plato and Aristotle might not have agreed on every detail, but they both saw governance as something deeply connected to human virtue and reason. And that's something we shouldn't forget. All right, and on that note, I think we'll wrap it up here. Reflecting on how ancient wisdom can, guide us through modern challenges is always fascinating. Thanks for joining me on this journey through the philosophies of Plato and Aristotle. Until next time, take care.